The Mormons were a people in trouble. October 27, 1838. Missouri Governor Lilburn W. Boggs signed Executive Order 44 declaring the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Subsequently, thousands of Missouri state militia forces were called out and surrounded the Latter-day Saint settlement of far west Missouri and demanded that the Mormons leave the state immediately according to the governor's order. But where could approximately 6,000 people go on a moment's notice as winter approached? They were already on the western frontier of the United States. They could not go south. That was deeper into hostile territory. They could not go west. That was Indian land. Nor could they go north, for that was Iowa territory and sparsely settled at best. The decision was made to go east toward Quincy, Illinois. There were Latter-day Saints already there, and land was available. So the Mormons turned their wagons toward Quincy. To hasten their departure, mobs continued to prey upon the Mormons, plundering, harassing, and threatening. Joseph and Hiram Smith and other church leaders were taken prisoner, and it was commonly understood by the Mormons that they would be held until every one of them had left the state.
We found that there was no more peace or safety for the saints in the state of Missouri. If the church would make haste and move as fast as possible, it would aid much to relieve our brethren who are now in jail, as our enemies were determined to hold them as hostages until the church left the state. Every exertion was made in the dead of winter to remove as fast as possible. Joseph Holbrook.
By December 1838, the Mormons began to move, with whatever conveyance they could obtain, leaving behind prosperous farms, livestock, and personal possessions. Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball organized them and did their best to gather resources to get them out. They would not rest until all were safely out of Missouri. By the bitter cold of January 1839, there were hundreds of men, women, and children strung out along the nearly 200-mile trail leading east. For some Latter-day Saints, it would become their trail of tears. The weather was forbidding. At times, the snow fell up to a foot deep, followed by wind and bitter cold. At other times, their way was marred by rain and deep mud. There was never enough food or clothing. Some were barefoot, especially the children, their way across the prairie marked by bloody footprints. So rigorous was this journey that not all would survive. By February 1839, hundreds of Mormon refugees lined the west bank up and down the Mississippi River. Wagons filled with families and all they owned would pull to the river's western edge, drop their passengers and possessions in the mud or on the ice, and turn and leave to help evacuate more. At times, the mighty river was impassable, as large chunks of floating ice prevented any boat traffic. Under these conditions, the Mormons were trapped against the river, with Missourians terrorizing them from behind. They could not leave and they could not stay. All they could do was hunker down and wait for the river to freeze so that they could cross over on the ice. Meanwhile, from across the river, the citizens of Quincy could see them and the misery that was happening.
A large number of families are encamped on the opposite bank of the Mississippi, waiting for an opportunity to cross. If they have been thrown upon our shores destitute through the oppressive people of Missouri, common humanity must oblige us to aid and relieve them, all in our power. The Quincy Whig.
Sometimes the shelter of the refugees consisted of nothing more than a blanket thrown over a low-hanging limb. It was under these conditions that one Latter-day Saint woman, Martha Thomas, gave birth. Her bed on the ice with quilts thrown over a rope or a tent. The story is told of one John Hawley, the only man to volunteer to take a loaded canoe of supplies from Quincy across the river to stranded families. Hawley couldn't swim, yet he braved the ice floes, fought the canoe, while citizens of Quincy watched and prayed. Hawley made it, much to the relief of those families. When the people of Quincy inquired of the Mormons their needs, they were told,
"If we should say what our present wants are, it would be beyond all calculation, as we have been robbed of our corn, wheat, horses, cattle, hogs, wearing apparel, houses and homes, and indeed all that renders life tolerable. Give us employment, rent us farms, and allow us the protection and privileges of other citizens."
The river alternately froze and thawed through January and February. Sometime in February 1839, the temperatures dropped enough and the river froze solid. The Mormons braved the ice and walked across. 11-year-old Mosiah Hancock talked of struggling to walk across the clear and slippery ice barefoot. As he neared the eastern bank, the ice began to break up.
Father said, "Run, Mosiah," and I did run. We all just made it on the opposite bank when the ice started to snap and pile up in great heaps, and the water broke through.
The relief of some at finally being free of Missouri was so great that they dropped to their knees on Illinois soil, kissed the ground, and offered up prayers of thanksgiving. Some made camp there below Quincy on the banks of the river, while others struggled up the bluffs into the main square of Quincy, Washington Park, where they established a tent city. Wilford Woodruff walked among them and described what he saw.
"I saw a great many of the saints, old and young, lying in the mud and water, in a rainstorm, without tent or covering. The sight filled my eyes with tears."
The citizens of Quincy had compassion on them, especially the suffering women and children, and determined to take them in. The cry for compassion was led by Quincy's mayor and founder, John Wood. It was another of Quincy's leading sons, Orville Browning, an attorney, who, as an eyewitness of their suffering, later declared,
"Great God, have I not seen it? Yes, my eyes have beheld the blood-stained traces of innocent women and children in the drear winter, who had traveled hundreds of miles barefoot through frost and snow to seek refuge from their savage pursuers." Orville Browning.
Compassion overwhelmed the people of Quincy, and as they had done before and would do again, they took in the homeless and ministered to the suffering. They brought the Mormons into their homes, hotels, even their barns. Every space that could be made hospitable was opened to the Mormons. They filled Quincy to overflowing and spread out into Adams County. John Low Butler, a Mormon, described the kindness that so typified the people of Quincy.
"The old gentleman came to me and told me to bring my family up to one of his houses, and we could live in it until we had been there a little while, so we should have a little time to look about us and get a place. He never charged us anything for what we had. There were 3 or 4 other families living close to us that were Mormons. They were living in his houses that were joining ours. He treated them all with kindness. It seemed a new thing to us, to be treated with so much kindness." John Low Butler.
The small community of Quincy, Illinois, numbering less than 2,000 people, somehow absorbed several thousand Mormons, giving them not only shelter, but food, clothing, and jobs. What the people of Quincy couldn't provide from their own stores, they sent out pleas for assistance as far away as Washington, D.C. and the Mormons would never forget what was done for them and by whom.
It would be impossible to enumerate all those who in our time of deep distress nobly came forward to our relief and, like the Good Samaritan, poured oil into our wounds and contributed liberally to our necessities.
Then, April 1839, after most of the Mormons were out of Missouri, Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, was released or allowed to escape prison in Missouri. He made his way to Quincy and there found his family and thousands of his people. For just the brief period of 3 months, Quincy, Illinois was the headquarters of Mormonism. Some citizens of Quincy joined the Mormons and traveled on with them, Ezra T. Benson and others, and some would travel no further. Their suffering had been enough. Brigham Young's father, John Young, lies buried in Quincy. By the summer of 1839, Joseph Smith had begun the foundations of a new city, roughly 50 miles north of Quincy, that would come to be called Nauvoo, the City Beautiful. While most of the Latter-day Saints settled in Nauvoo and Hancock County after that, some chose to stay and made Quincy and Adams County their home. 7 years later, 1846, the Mormons left Illinois for a new home in the Rocky Mountains, and again, it was the citizens of Quincy who rallied, loading barges with food, clothing, and supplies, and sailed them up the Mississippi to the aid of the poorest of the Mormons for their journey west. The legacy of Quincy will endure forever as one of humanitarian compassion. Their kindness and sacrifice will live forever, and especially with those whose families were sheltered and saved in Quincy in the cold winter of 1839. Those who survived that ordeal said this of the deeds of Quincy and their place in history.
They burst the chains of slavery and proclaimed us forever free. Quincy, our first noble city of refuge, when we came from the slaughter in Missouri with our garments stained with blood, should not be forgotten.